The Russia-Ukraine war has highlighted and worsened systematic weaknesses in the current international food system, which pose a disproportionate risk to African countries. This is due, in large, to the high dependence on fuel and food imports. I am Busisipo Siobi, lead researcher at GGA, and to unpack the topic in more detail are my colleagues Stephen Buchanan-Clarke, head of the Human Security and Climate Change Program, and Leleti Maluleke, researcher in the same program. What are some of the factors that have led to global food insecurity?
There are a lot of driving factors, especially when you're speaking about Africa. But what we have seen is that the rising food prices as well as the population growth has contributed to the food insecurity that we're seeing. Also, the climate change impact that have led to drought and flooding in some countries have also contributed to a massive food insecurity that we're seeing in countries like Sudan and Somalia.
And looking at Africa specifically, why is it disproportionately vulnerable to the international food insecurity that we're seeing?
We do not have the ability to store our own grains or seeds, and we do not have the infrastructure, needed for us to build our agricultural economy. Taking into account that 40% of the world's food program with supplies comes from Ukraine and Russia, this has an impact on African countries. So anything that happens in these countries will automatically affect, African countries.
How has climate-induced events exacerbated food crises on the continent?
What we're seeing is these climate change impacts has direct effect on our ability to produce food locally. For example, poor rainy season since 2020 has seen extended droughts in countries like Kenya and Somalia. Countries like Djibouti, Mozambique, and South Sudan have seen extensive floodings. Moreover, due to some of the continent's developmental challenges, many African states lack the adaptive and mitigative capacity to address some of the challenges posed by climate change. So, for example, when it comes to repairing infrastructure that may have been damaged by extreme weather events or switching to more climate resilient crops. These are something that many states battle to achieve, and therefore it creates a sort of systemic vulnerability for the continent.
How have local conflicts impacted food security in some of the regions?
So conflict and food security are closely intertwined. Where one escalates, the other does tend to follow. Conflict disrupts local food production, be it as a result of direct damage to agricultural infrastructure, the displacement of farming communities, or the exploitation of food as a weapon of war. Food insecurity in itself is often a trigger of conflict. And so this creates a cycle of fragility that is quite difficult to break out of.
What is meant by the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification?
So the Integrated Food Security Classification System, or the IPC system, was developed by the World Food Programme as a way to measure the extent and the severity of food insecurity using a common set of indicators. Countries are ranked between 1 and 5, 1 being low levels of food insecurity all the way up to famine levels of food insecurity. Based on their most recent reports, it is assumed that populations within at least 20 African countries will experience crisis levels of food insecurity in 2022. And at least 3 African countries, namely Somalia, Ethiopia, and South Sudan, may experience famine or catastrophic levels of food insecurity this year.
And then final thoughts on how the private-public partnerships can be used as means of intervention to essentially better and improve the situation when it comes to food insecurity on the continent.
We know that food insecurity has cascading effects on political security and economic stability. So investing in food security initiatives will ultimately help to create the environment in which businesses can thrive. Leveraging private-public partnerships, bolstering government's capacity to supply choke point risk analysis, to invest in local skills and capacity building, particularly within the agricultural sciences. However, there's also a lot that African governments need to do to encourage businesses invested in Africa to work in unison with them on this issue. For example, private companies should be brought in at the early stages of policy development, particularly when it's policies that impact upon them. Red tape and bureaucracy needs to be cut. Different tax breaks and other sorts of incentives can be put in place to encourage this.
Thank you very much, both Leleti and Stephen, for providing us with those insights. It is evident that companies invested in Africa should prioritize policy and investment choices that help to build sustainable, resilient, and inclusive food systems. For more in-depth discussions on policy matters in Africa, please join us again. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel.